There's an old history cliche that goes something along the lines of hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. It's a interesting saying that you'll often see thrown around in discussions related to history or politics. And the idea is that there is this cyclical way of looking at history. One generation goes through tough times or a war or economic crisis of some sort, and they have no choice but to build up resolve and demonstrate physical and mental toughness and maybe learn some of the virtues of what it takes to live during hard times. Then, according to the theory at least, these strong men who've come up during these hard times can use the knowledge that they've accumulated and use the wisdom that they've accumulated from these hard times, and they can create a better society for their country or their city-state or whatever time period in history, whatever group of people that is. But once those good times or so-called good times are created, that society might lose some of the edge. They might start bringing in kids and grandkids who have no knowledge of the hard times that came before, and they lose that mental and physical toughness. And maybe even from a historical point of view, they might lose the historical memory. And they might start forgetting why the knowledge was needed or the hard work was needed or the values of the society were the way that they are. And according to the theory, this creates a generation of softer or weaker people, and those people are unable to deal with the realities of the world and the hardships of the world, and that leads to hard times. And so the cycle continues. This is not a new idea, by the way. Versions of this quote or different historians or thinkers' takes on this idea are prevalent throughout history. Another example would be Voltaire, the famous French philosopher, who said that history is filled with the sound of silken slippers going downstairs and wooden shoes coming up. So similar idea there. And Voltaire maybe writing more in the context of the build up to the French Revolution, but we still see this idea of cyclical history and something about this concept of difficult times or war or crisis creating the conditions necessary for people to meet the challenge and then maybe slowly lose that edge over time. In Book 1 of the Odyssey, we see this historical idea playing out very clearly. The story plays out in the aftermath of the mythical Trojan War in ancient Greece. So we're talking late 1100s BC, and we're firmly in the lore of ancient Greece and the mythology of ancient Greece here. And we're going to delve into all of that, but the story begins on the island of Ithaca, where Odysseus, who is going to be our main character, was the king of this island, but he went off to fight in the Trojan War 20 years earlier, and on his return home got lost, and no one has heard from him since. And on the island, Odysseus has left behind his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus, who he's never met. And right away, we're introduced to one of the central conflicts in the poem, which is this idea that Odysseus has been gone for so long. As a result, the nobles on the island are all vying to get married to Penelope so that they can assume control of Odysseus' kingdom and essentially become the new king. So you have this group of young men, mostly, who Homer in the play calls the suitors. And the suitors basically hang out at Odysseus's house and they court Penelope and they eat all of Odysseus's food and they order around his servants and basically are the worst house guests ever. But the idea is that they're hanging around to try to put pressure on Penelope to pick one of them so that they can assume control of Ithaca. Penelope, for her part, has been delaying this process for as long as she can, but things are getting dire, and there is a sense that Odysseus, if he's alive at all, needs to return soon, or Penelope's not going to have a choice but to marry one of these suitors. Telemachus, Odysseus' son, remember, he never met Odysseus. He wasn't born before Odysseus left for the Trojan War. So his whole life has been in this weird position of basically every day having to deal with these suitors who are trying to sleep with his mom. And they're also making fun of him, and they see him as kind of a weak baby who doesn't have any strength or fortitude. And Telemachus has to kind of sit there and watch as they eat all of his food, basically use up all of his wealth that would be passed down from Odysseus, and eat all of his food and, again, be the worst house guests ever. And it's interesting that the Odyssey starts not with Odysseus and where he's at and what he's up to, but it starts with the suitors. And remember that quote from Voltaire: "History is filled with the sound of silken slippers going downstairs and wooden shoes coming up." The suitors represent the vices of a society in decline: greed, corruption, selfishness, etc. The suitors are soft men. They haven't lived hard lives. They have not seen the things that Odysseus has seen, and they haven't been through the wars and the battles and the times being stuck in captivity and the long search for a family and powering through hopelessness. They haven't spent time gathering wisdom from the histories or their elders or philosophy. Again, they basically just hang out in Penelope's house. They eat Odysseus' food, they play games, and they mess around with the slaves and the serving men and women. Early in book 1, Telemachus gives his thoughts on the suitors. And by the way, I read a couple translations here of the Odyssey. I prefer the Fitzgerald translation and the Emily Wilson translation, so I'm going to be bouncing around between those two when I quote. But anyway, Telemachus, summing up the suitors, says, quote, "These men are only interested in music, a life of ease. They make no contribution. This food belongs to someone else, a man whose white bones may be lying in the rain or sunk beneath the waves. If they saw him return to Ithaca, they would all pray for faster feet instead of wealth and gold and fancy clothes. In fact, he must have died. We have no hope. He will not come back home. If someone says so, we do not believe it." End quote. So early on, you can see that Telemachus is pretty dejected and pretty despondent at the idea of Odysseus coming home. And why would he have any good reason to think that Odysseus was going to come home after all this time? But again, you have to feel for Telemachus here. He's never met his father. He probably thinks his father's dead. He has to sit there and mingle with these suitors every day, and it's kind of a weird position to be in. He's not really established himself as, quote unquote, the man of the house. He was too young to do that. He doesn't really feel like he has any authority, and right now the suitors don't respect him at all. He's just a boy mingling with lions, and he's not respected. But luckily for Telemachus, Athena, the goddess of wisdom in ancient Greek mythology, loves Odysseus and she's taken an interest in Telemachus as well. And she recognizes that at some point here, Telemachus is going to need to be able to strum up his own authority and call on his own ability to manage things in a crucial moment. And he will end up doing that later. But again, right now, he doesn't have that confidence. He doesn't have the respect of his household. And he needs to get his house in order before Odysseus can return. And so begins the first of many, many divine interventions in the Odyssey. The gods are everywhere in this poem, particularly Athena. And we didn't talk about this yet, but actually the first couple of pages of the Odyssey before things turn over to the island of Ithaca is a discussion between Zeus and Athena. So you have this interesting theme that's starting to develop in the Odyssey where we have the world of the gods and we have the world of humans. What are the similarities between the two worlds, and how much do those two worlds interact with each other? And what are the values of both of those worlds, and how do they conflict with each other? These are going to be huge themes in the Odyssey. So in that discussion between Zeus and Athena, we learn that Athena is trying to bring Odysseus home. She knows that he was lost after the Trojan War, and there's a whole series of events, which we're going to get into, that lead to that and ultimately tell us where Odysseus is right now, which is on this island with the goddess Calypso. But even here, you have this interesting little contradiction moment where Zeus says to Athena that men create their own folly and they should be in charge of solving their own problems. And Athena, of course, remember that she's the goddess of wisdom, but also kind of the military goddess of tactics, right? Because you have to be smart to know how to position troops in battle and how to organize logistics and all this stuff in war. Athena is much more willing to intervene here. And as we're going to learn, Zeus himself is contradicting himself, because many times, even during the Odyssey and also throughout Greek mythology, he's intervening with the affairs of humans. And again, you have this liminal barrier between the world of gods and the world of humans, where there's not as clear a distinction between the two things as we might think of in our more modern interpretations of what a god is. So even before we've met Odysseus, we're already starting to get into these themes, right? Where you have a society or maybe just an island in decline after a war, and the reverberations of the Trojan War, obviously leaving Penelope without a husband, leaving Telemachus without a father, and maybe just for Ithaca in general, with these suitors fighting and clawing to get the top job now, that's going to be a problem. You also have this theme of the world of gods and the world of men and how they interact. And so Athena comes down disguised as a guy named Mentes to talk to Telemachus and try to give him some counsel. And right away in this interaction, you get another major theme of the Odyssey, which is the idea of hospitality and civility and being respectful to strangers and people that are trying to enter your house. We're going to see this over and over, and you're probably going to get tired of me talking about it, but Telemachus immediately welcomes Mentes into the house, gives him food and drink, treats him respectfully, makes sure he's comfortable. And Athena, disguised as this guy Mentes again, is trying to provide some comfort to Telemachus, and she tells him that Odysseus is alive. And she recommends that he hold a council to get ships to go after him, or at least go find out news about where he is or where he might have gone. Penelope then appears, and she's a little bit mysterious. We don't know much about her yet. Telemachus immediately scolds Penelope and basically tells her to go back in her room. And it's kind of an example of Telemachus here trying to establish that authority again, and maybe even prove to himself that he can be the master of this house. And some of the suitors notice this and maybe crack a few jokes. But for Athena, she doesn't think that he's actually going to rescue Odysseus, but she's trying to get him to go on this trip to go talk to these other kings on the mainland of Greece to learn about Odysseus. And she's trying to gas him up a little bit, build up that confidence, and get him thinking in terms of, I am the authority of this palace on Ithaca, and I have a responsibility to protect it, because there will be a time in the future where Odysseus will need Telemachus, and Athena knows that. And so at Athena's urging, Telemachus convenes this big council where all the powerful men of Ithaca are going to get together and figure out what to do about Odysseus. So Telemachus is trying to urge people to give him ships and men to man the ships so that he can go out again towards the mainland and find out more information about his dad. And the second he gets done giving his opening speech, he breaks down and starts crying. So we can see that maybe Telemachus isn't ready yet. And maybe he does need this little extra bit of seasoning that Athena is trying to sprinkle on him with this trip, where he can kind of learn how to be a good Greek man and a good Greek ruler. We also start getting insight into the suitors, and we see kind of the hierarchy of the suitors, and a guy named Antinous, who is one of the ringleaders of the suitors and one of the leading candidates to marry Penelope. He kind of gets up and casts some aspersion on Telemachus, and he also tells us about Penelope's trick with the weaving of the shroud. So apparently Penelope had been promising the suitors that when she finished weaving this burial shroud, then at that point she would accept a marriage. And it turns out what Penelope was doing was she was weaving it during the day in view of the suitors, and then at night she would go into her bedroom and unweave everything she just did. So this shroud was taking years to weave, and nobody understood why. And Antinous is trying to say that this represents trickery and deception, and he's saying, look, Penelope needs to get married and somebody needs to take control of Ithaca, and this is just a matter of practicality here. But I think it's important to note that one person's trickery and deception could be another person's strategy and tactfulness. Despite the picture that Antinous is trying to paint of Penelope, this is our real first glimpse at Odysseus' wife Penelope, and it shows us a little bit about her. It shows us that she has some brains and she's capable of some manipulations, and she's trying to delay this process for as long as she can. And it's also showing us that she's loyal to Odysseus. She doesn't seem to want to get married right away to one of these guys. Obviously, it's been 20 years. But anyway, back to Antinous. Remember that he's trying to paint this whole situation with the suitors as simply practicality and rationality. The suitors are saying that it's been 20 years, Penelope needs a husband. If she doesn't want to get married to us, fine, then just send her back to Odysseus' father's town and, cede the throne to us. Odysseus isn't coming back, and we just need to make some rational decisions here. Now, as the assembly is going on, at one point, there's this weird moment where a bunch of birds come flying in and everybody's all out of whack for a few minutes, and some old guy starts shouting that this stuff with the birds is a prophecy that Odysseus is going to return home and all the suitors are going to get their comeuppance. and the birds are going to tear out the throats of the suitors and all this stuff. And this is what is fated to happen. And we can divine this from omens and some elements of mysticism. But then Eurymachus, who really is the other lead suitor in addition to Antinous, he takes all the stuff with the omens and the birds and he just craps on it, pun intended. Eurymachus says, quote, "Old man, go tell the omens for your children at home and try to keep them out of trouble. I am more fit to interpret this than you are. Bird life aplenty is found in the sunny air. Not all of it is significant. As for Odysseus, he perished far from home. You should have perished with him. Then we'd be spared this nonsense in assembly." End quote. Eurymachus goes on to say that the suitors are going to stay in Penelope's house until she picks one of them, and that's just the end of the discussion. We don't care about any of these predictions or any of that stuff. Now, I wanted to point out this exchange between Eurymachus and the divining bird guy, because it might seem like just a small, insignificant part of this assembly, but I think it hits on this theme of, again, the world of gods and the world of men. And related to that theme is the idea of practicality and rationality and reason. And in some ways, these are maybe the excuses that the suitors are using to justify their actions. And that worldview is put in stark contrast with ideas of prophecy and mystery and hope and divination. Because there's going to be so many times in this poem where somebody decides to basically do their own thing and try to defy fate or defy the gods. And almost always it never works out for that person. For the suitors here in just book 2 of the Odyssey, ignoring this prophecy and treating that old guy so badly and dismissing his omens is going to be a fatal mistake, because this guy's predicting exactly what is going to happen. Odysseus is going to return, spoiler alert, and things are not going to go well for the suitors. So perhaps if they had eased up on the so-called practicality and allowed some more room for fate or prophecy, things might have ended better for them. And again, at the assembly, another guy points out, hey, suitors, what are you going to do if Odysseus does come back? And for Antinous and Eurymachus, it would just be a numbers game at that point, and they're confident that they can overwhelm Odysseus because they have way more numbers on their side. So by the end of the assembly, it's clear that Telemachus kind of loses here. He doesn't get the ship and the men that he asked for. He's not going to be able to go search for his father. They do tell him, hey, if you want to do this, you can go do it on your own. And while you're at it, take all of your father's loyal men with you. Everybody goes back to the palace, and the suitors start mocking Telemachus at dinner. Telemachus says, even though he didn't get the verdict at the assembly, he's going to find his ship and find men to help him, and he's going to go find his dad, and he's going to bring doom down on all of the suitors. And here, one of the suitors responds saying, quote, "Oh no, Telemachus is going to kill us. He will bring supporters from Pylos or from Sparta. He is quite determined. Or indeed, he may be fetching some lethal poisons from the fertile fields of Ephyra to mix up in our wine bowl and kill us all." End quote. Another suitor says, quote, "Well, who knows? Perhaps he will get lost in that curved ship and die, so far away from all his family, just like his father. And what a pity that would be for us. Then we would have to share out all his wealth and give away the house itself to her, his mother, and the man who marries her." End quote. So the suitors are basically saying, hey, good luck. Don't die on the trip. And there's a bit of a implied threat there that maybe he is going to die on that trip and the suitors will get everything they wanted. And I think it's interesting here that there's definitely a layer of cruelty and meanness to the suitors. And this is all under the guise of, again, practicality and rationality, which is what they made it seem like at the assembly. The dripping sarcasm where they're saying, oh, what a shame it would be if he died on the trip. At any rate, while Telemachus and the suitors are sleeping, Athena dresses up in a disguise again, and she goes around Ithaca and she recruits sailors to the trip that Telemachus wants to take, and she gathers a ship as well. And we really see the extent to which Athena is manipulating things here, where on the one hand, she's giving Telemachus the chance to speak at the assembly and kind of do things his way. But if Telemachus isn't getting it done, Athena's going to do it for him. And she gathers a crew, she gathers a ship, tells him what's going on. And then before the end of the night, he sets off. The plan is for Telemachus to go to the mainland of Greece, where he's going to meet with King Nestor of a place called Pylos and King Menelaus of Sparta. Nestor and Menelaus both fought with Odysseus in the Trojan War. So we're now getting into books 3 and 4 of the Odyssey. We still haven't really met Odysseus yet, but these 2 chapters in particular are going to give us a lot of background information on the Trojan War and how Greek society kind of worked at the time and how Odysseus was perceived. Telemachus arrives at King Nestor's palace, and note that right away, Nestor offers Telemachus what we might call guest right or hospitality rights. Bring in the stranger, feed them, clothe them, bathe them. And oftentimes this happens even before you start asking questions about who they are or why they're here or what their purpose is. Remember that Telemachus did this with Athena when she was disguised as Mentes, and Telemachus didn't know that he was actually talking to Athena. He might have suspected. But again, this theme of hospitality and guest right comes up again. And of course, it's not too hard to make the jump from how a king or how a host is supposed to treat guests in their house. And we see it with Telemachus, we see it with Nestor, we'll see it again with Menelaus when Telemachus makes his way to the next king. But we can obviously contrast this with the suitors who are violating guest right. They're violating the civility and the norms of the time, because there's a two-way street to guest right. There's things you're supposed to do as the host, but there's also things that you're supposed to do as the guest. You're supposed to be respectful and not over-consume and these types of things. And obviously the suitors are just crashing at Odysseus' house. Telemachus doesn't want them there. Penelope doesn't either. And they're eating all the food and they're using all the resources and they're fooling around with the servants and the slaves. But anyway, once the hospitality and civilities are observed, Nestor tells his story. He talks about his memories from the Trojan War. And this might be a good time to note that there is a story that comes before the Odyssey. It's called the Iliad. It's also by Homer, author of the Odyssey, and we're going to talk about Homer and who he may have been in the next episode. But the Iliad chronicles certain parts of the Trojan War, and it provides a lot of background information for the Odyssey. So a lot of people recommend reading the Iliad before the Odyssey. I actually think that the Odyssey stands alone, and they do enough of a job of talking about the background of the Trojan War to allow you to understand what's going on with the story of the Odyssey and Odysseus. So I think the Iliad adds important context, but I think you can read the Odyssey as a standalone piece. Now, the Trojan War is a significant event in Greek history. And there's a lot of debate about the history of the Trojan War, whether or not it actually happened, when it happened. But in the fictional world of the Odyssey, which is based on Greek myth and Greek history, the Trojan War does happen. And we have to remember that ancient Greece was not necessarily a monolith. We've kind of already talked about this, but Greece was made up of what we call city-states. So in general, they shared a collective mythology and a collective culture, but the politics and the societies and the economies of the different city-states could be radically different. And identities could formulate that were different across geography and across the differences in city-states. So obviously there's Sparta, there's Athens, Corinth, Thebes, etc. But some people see this Trojan War as something that helped to unite these different city-states into not one country politically, but maybe a shared culture and mythology. So according to the legend, Menelaus was the king of Sparta, Helen was his wife, and supposedly there was this guy, Paris, from the city-state of Troy, which was in modern-day Turkey, near the Dardanelles, kind of across the Aegean Sea. And supposedly Paris either steals Helen away from Menelaus or Helen falls in love with him and voluntarily decides to leave. But whatever the case, Helen is now in Troy, so you might have heard of Helen of Troy. But with Helen gone, Menelaus and some of the other Greek kings have a pact where they're going to unite together and go attack Troy. It turns out Odysseus is one of the captains or one of the higher-ups in the Greek operation in the Trojan War. He's involved with a lot of the sneaky deceptions and some of the plans that ultimately lead to Greek victory. So now we're here with Telemachus and King Nestor. And Nestor is telling his memories of the Trojan War. And he's saying that after the war was over, him and Menelaus and Agamemnon, who is another important figure in the Trojan War lore that we're going to talk about in a second. But Nestor is saying that all of these guys got split up along with their troops upon coming home from the war. For Nestor, that was the last he saw of Odysseus, so he doesn't necessarily know where he is now or who he's with. He thinks he might be with Agamemnon. But listening to Nestor tell his stories of the Trojan War and sort of the post-war grief that he's trying to convey, I think is important for the Odyssey here, because we always have to remember that everything that's happening in the Odyssey is happening in the shadow of this war. And this really is a post-war poem. All of the characters are making decisions in the shadow of this massive traumatic event that happened to everybody. Nestor has a great moment where he's talking with Telemachus and he's trying to explain this post-war grief that's happening. And he's trying to list off all of the people that are important to him that died. And he's eventually stopping because he realizes if you just kept listing name after name, tragedy after tragedy, eventually the listener would just get bored. Something would be lost in the translation. And there's no real way to communicate the suffering that you feel to the external world. Nestor says, quote, "Dear boy, you call to mind how much we suffered with strong, unyielding hearts in distant lands, when we were sailing over misty seas, led by Achilles on a hunt for spoils. and when we fought around the mighty city of Priam. Our best warriors were killed. Ajax lies dead there, and there lies Achilles. There lies his godlike friend and guide, Patroclus. My own strong, matchless son lies dead there too. Antilochus, who fought and ran so well. More pain, more grief, our sufferings increased. Who could recount so many, many losses? If you stayed here for 5 years and kept on asking how many things the fighters suffered there, you would get bored and go back home again before the story ended. End quote. There is something interesting here about the nature of human suffering, how sometimes that rarely extends beyond line of sight. For Nestor, what is the tragic loss of his friends and family, for Telemachus eventually will just seem like a string of names being listed. Nestor also tells an important story about what happened to the great king Agamemnon, who we mentioned earlier. While Agamemnon was away fighting, a scheming advisor in his court, Odysseus, seduced his wife and married her and took the kingdom for himself. When Agamemnon returned years later, Odysseus tricked Agamemnon into coming to a feast in honor of him coming home again. And at the feast, he killed Agamemnon and all of his loyal supporters, Red Wedding, Game of Thrones style. The moral of that story for Nestor that he tells Telemachus is, don't be away for too long. Don't be away from home too long, and maybe also always keep an eye behind you. So there are interesting parallels here to history, and maybe it's important to keep an eye behind you and keep an eye on the shadow of the past as it throws that shadow into the present and into the future. Nestor warning Telemachus, hey, this happened to Agamemnon, and it's certainly not a stretch to think that it could happen to Odysseus as well. He could have his wife stolen from him, and he could be killed when he comes home to these suitors. At any rate, King Nestor sends Telemachus on his way to the next king, the king of Sparta, Menelaus, and Nestor sends his son with Telemachus, and they become seemingly pretty close friends. When Telemachus arrives in Sparta, he gets a much different welcome from Menelaus. Menelaus is a little more bombastic than King Nestor was, and there's a lot of celebrations and weddings going on. And Menelaus eventually tells Telemachus that Odysseus is shipwrecked with the beautiful goddess Calypso. So at least here, Telemachus knows that Odysseus was alive at some point here and may still be. Menelaus has some very fond things to say about Odysseus. He enjoyed their time together and obviously has a lot of respect for Odysseus and now Telemachus too. And during one of these speeches where Menelaus is talking about how great Odysseus is, Telemachus breaks down and cries again. So this is now the second time that he's broken down and cried in an important moment. And there's a nice moment of friendship where Nestor's son, Pisistratus, speaks up for Telemachus while he's unable to talk because he's crying. Pisistratus says, quote, "King Menelaus, you are right. This is truly his son, just as you say he is. But he is shy and feels he should not speak too boldly in your presence right away. Your voice is like a god's to us. Lord Nestor sent me to guide him here. He longed to see you to get some news from you or some advice. A son whose father is away will suffer intensely if he has no man at home to help him. In the absence of his father, Telemachus has no one to protect him." End quote. I think it's also interesting to note that during this meeting between Menelaus and Telemachus, we also get a look at Menelaus' wife, the famed Helen of Troy. And if we remember from our little Trojan War synopsis there, Helen's role in the Trojan War was huge. It was because she was kidnapped or taken, or maybe because she fell in love with this guy Paris who takes her to Troy. That's the reason the Trojan War started. And Homer in the Odyssey here seems to keep things a little bit ambiguous as far as Helen's role in the Trojan War. Was she stolen by Paris, or did she go under her own volition? I think mythologically speaking, there's different versions of the story, but there is a hint here at which way the Odyssey might lean. At a certain point in the night, Helen basically offers to drug everybody's wine with a substance that will make people forget and ease their way into a dreamless sleep. I call this the tincture of forgetting, where a little sprinkle of the drug in your wine is going to make you forget all of the pain and all of the suffering and all of the sorrow that comes along with being human. Sure, this might lead to a nice, solid night of sleep, but there's also something a little bit amiss here. If we remember what King Nestor said to Telemachus, which was basically, don't be away for too long, keep an eye behind you, and don't forget to always heed the past, then there is something amiss with the way that Menelaus and Helen are living their lives here. We're having these big parties, these big celebrations, and sure, we remember the war and we have emotions that get stirred up as a result of remembering that, but at any moment we can just drink the tincture of forgetting and be at peace. But I guess the question is, if you have to drink that potion, are you really at peace? Because if you really were at peace, you wouldn't need to drink it. And I think this idea might hint at Helen's feelings and her role in the Trojan War from the perspective of the Odyssey, right? Where maybe it was that she had this affair with Paris and she regrets how this started the Trojan War and all the emotions that gets stirred up. And perhaps that's why she is so keen on having this potion for all of her guests to drink and presumably herself to drink as well. Now, we're still in book 4 here, which is one of the longest books of the Odyssey. And towards the end, we get a shift in perspective back to Ithaca, and we get a look at the suitors and we get a look at Penelope. This shift is really another example about how the Odyssey is a post-war book. So in the beginning of this chapter, we have Menelaus telling his stories of the Trojan War. And in the end of the chapter, we're now getting the effects of what happened in that war and the people leaving to go fight and the vacuum that they left behind. And we can really see the pain and the grief that Penelope has for the husband that she's lost, as well as the son who has now disappeared. And we have to remember that without the Trojan War, none of that happens. Odysseus is still home. Telemachus is still home. And we start to see how war can lead to these cycles of violence. Even now in Penelope's dining hall, there's these rabid group of suitors who smell blood in the water. War begets war. And these guys are preparing to eventually fight Odysseus if it comes to it. And we start to see these cycles of violence emerging. And anytime there's war, you don't know the downstream effects of what that war is going to lead to. And you can't predict what's going to happen with any amount of certainty. So as the suitors figure out what's going on with Telemachus and sail off to go lay a trap for him in one of the straits of Ithaca and eventually kill him, Athena visits Penelope, and Penelope outlines the grief and the emotion that she's feeling as a result of war. She says, quote, "And my bid be done with all my grieving, but see what anguish hath my heart and soul. My lord, my lion heart, gone, long ago, the bravest man and the best of the Danaans, famous through Hellas and the Argive midlands. And now my son, my dear one, gone seafaring, a child, untrained in hardship or in counsel. For him I weep more than his father. How I tremble for him, lest some blow befall him at men's hands or on the sea. Cruel are they and many who plot against him to take his life before he can return." End quote. Penelope is then given a dream by Athena, who keeps sending herself as real people to meddle in things and try to control the situation. I think there's maybe something here about the ethics of using another person's body without them knowing it, and then going and visiting all these people in disguise. And that's a whole thing to keep an eye on as the story progresses. But also, if we just remember that conversation that Zeus and Athena had earlier, where Zeus says that men make their own folly and kind of advises Athena, maybe stay out of things a little bit more than you're trying to. And Athena continues to get involved. One might wonder why she can't just tell Penelope that Odysseus is alive at this point and she has a plan and she's going to help him. That would seemingly make things a little better, but again, we can't fully understand this realm of the gods, even when sometimes they behave like humans. And sure enough, at the beginning of book 5 of the Odyssey, we're back to one of these conversations between Zeus and Athena. And Zeus basically asks Athena this same question. Athena is complaining, trying to get more help for Telemachus because Telemachus is now in danger. The suitors are trying to kill him. Zeus says to her, "Hey, wait a second. You're the one that orchestrated this whole operation. You were the one that gave Telemachus the idea to go sail to meet these kings. You drummed up the ship and the crew, and now you're the one kind of complaining about it." So again, we have this question of gods meddling in human affairs, and this question of the world of gods and the world of humans. And the world of gods is sometimes associated here with fate and destiny. And, going against the gods is going to be something that's a bad idea. And these forces of fate and destiny are capable of altering the course of your life. But it's just funny because these powers are simultaneously all powerful, but they're also flawed and short-sighted. The fact that Zeus and Athena are even having this conversation tells us that the Greek gods are not all powerful. And when you're entrusting your fate into the hands of the gods, that can also be a roll of the dice, because oftentimes they behave just like humans with all of the emotions and the pride and the jealousies that we might find in the human world. And just as a little aside here, I think part of that is what makes Greek mythology so interesting for so many people for so long of a period of time, that people have been into this stuff. If you come from a more modern sort of monotheistic tradition, generally speaking, God is seen as a perfect, all-knowing, all-doing being. The separation between the human world and the afterlife or the world of the gods is very clear. But in Greek mythology, that's part of the fun, is that the opposite is true. The gods are powerful, but they're also doing a lot of very human things. As we're going to see in a second, they're sleeping with humans, They're arguing over petty stuff. They're remembering past grievances and trying to get revenge. And it's one of the things that's so appealing about this mythological world is that we can immediately identify with the things they're doing because they're all very human things. These questions of fate and destiny and the role that gods play in the life of humans brings us to Calypso, who I think is really one of the more interesting characters in this story. So, as we know, Odysseus shipwrecks on Calypso's island and she takes him in, she takes care of him, she probably seduces him in one way or another. They have this relationship that is sexual, but on the other hand, you also kind of have to wonder, is this a totally consensual thing? Because in some ways it does kind of seem like Odysseus is a prisoner on this island, and it definitely seems like Odysseus wants to go. But then again, maybe he's not fighting as hard as he could be to be going home. After all, he is stuck on an island alone with maybe the most beautiful woman in ancient Greece. So part of the intriguing element here is figuring out what is going on between Odysseus and Calypso. But Calypso definitely seems to serve this role of questioning the gods and even Zeus himself. Athena and Zeus send Hermes to go talk to Calypso and tell her to release Odysseus and give him a boat and all these things. And Calypso eventually agrees. She goes along with it, but she definitely doesn't like it. One way to read it is that she might think the gods are jealous of her relationship with Odysseus. After all, they're the ones who screwed up Odysseus. Poseidon is the one who made him get shipwrecked, which we'll eventually get to, but that wasn't Calypso's fault. She's the one who found him and took care of him, and in her mind, she's doing the right thing. So again, Calypso ultimately agrees to this, but not before ripping Hermes a little bit. She gives a great speech here, saying, quote, "Oh, you vile gods, in jealousy supernal, you hate it when we choose to lie with men, immortal flesh by some dear mortal's side. So radiant dawn once took to bed Orion, until you easeful gods grew peevish at it, and holy Artemis, Artemis throned in gold, hunted him down in Delos with her arrows. Then Demeter of the tasseled tresses yielded to Elysium, mingling and making love in a furrow 3 times plowed. But Zeus found out and killed him with a white-hot thunderbolt. So now you grudge me too, my mortal friend. But it was I who saved him, saw him straddle his own keelboard, the one man left afloat, when Zeus rent wide his ship with chain lightning, and overturned him in the wine-dark sea. Then all his troops were lost, his good companions, but wind and current washed him here to me. I fed him, loved him, saying that he should not die nor grow old, ever, in all the days to come. But now there's no eluding Zeus's will. If this thing be ordained by him, I say so be it. Let the man strike out alone on the vast water. Surely I cannot send him. I have no long-oared ships, no company to pull him on the broad back of the sea. My counsel he shall have, and nothing hidden, to help him homeward without harm." End quote. Scholars have debated with Calypso whether there also wasn't some sort of veiled gender critique of the norms of ancient Greek society in her speech there and some other places in the text. Because as she points out, why are the gods getting mad when I'm sleeping with Odysseus? Why are they mad now all of a sudden? And certainly nobody seems to care when Zeus or Ares go out and have affairs with human women, so it seems like it might only be a problem when it's a female goddess. Some scholars think the critique might just be more about greater gods and lesser gods in the ancient Greek pantheon. So maybe it's more that the top level gods like Zeus can do whatever they want, but the lower level gods and goddesses like Calypso, not as much leeway is given to them. At any rate, Calypso goes to tell Odysseus the news, and about 5 books into the Odyssey and an hour into this podcast, we get our first look at the main character of the Odyssey. Based on what we've heard about Odysseus so far, we might think that he would be, shirtless, training with sword and shield, and kind of depicting that impressive power and martial cunning that made him so well regarded back on the mainland. But in a little bit of a subversion, the first glimpse we get of the great hero is Odysseus as essentially a completely broken man. The first time we see him, he's crying and he's looking out at the sea. He's filled with memories of the past and he's longing to get back home. This passage here depicts Calypso going to tell Odysseus that he's going to be going home. Quote, "Her ladyship, having given heed to Zeus's mandate, went to find Odysseus in his stone seat to seaward, tear on tear brimming his eyes. The sweet days of his lifetime were running out in anguish over his exile, for long ago the nymph had ceased to please. Though he fought shy of her and her desire, he lay with her each night, for she compelled him. But when day came, he sat on the rocky shore and broke his own heart groaning, with eyes wet scanning the bare horizon of the sea." End quote. Calypso then tells Odysseus that it's her idea that she wants to let him go. She brings him back to their cave and they have some food and drink, and maybe Calypso slips a few more drinks to Odysseus and tries to seduce him one more time, and they do end up spending the night together and having sex. People who read the Odyssey, especially in more modern times, often point out that this could be an example of maybe a gender inequality between Odysseus and Penelope here. So Odysseus does sleep with Calypso, and on the one hand, Odysseus, as we're going to find out, is very cunning and tactful, and maybe he only slept with Calypso because he didn't want to enrage her. And maybe sleeping with her, especially that last night, was just a way to mollify a more powerful being. But I think critics of that viewpoint would say that if Penelope did the exact same thing to protect herself or save herself, or if she used the exact same justification to sleep with one of the suitors, then it's very likely that Odysseus would, at the very least, not be very happy. And it's also possible that Penelope would be disowned or even have her life be in danger. Classicist Emily Wilson points this out, saying that in the poem, Odysseus's affairs with other women are generally overlooked or even seen as normal. But on the other hand, Penelope's lack of affairs and her fidelity, incredibly, for 20 years when most normal people would have thought Odysseus was long dead, Penelope's fidelity is the very foundation of her worth as a person in the eyes of many people. And if she hadn't have been true to Odysseus, she probably would have been tossed aside. So there is a double standard here. So this theme of gender in the ancient Greek world and Odysseus's affair with Calypso, I think is interesting, not just from a modern perspective, but I think it's also a theme to keep in mind as the Odyssey continues here, because it sheds a lot of light on Odysseus as a very complicated figure. And just like we saw with that first view of him, where the expectations of what we thought we might see with this great war hero and what we got were subverted a little bit. I think Odysseus is a complicated figure, and this affair with Calypso starts to get at that, where we might question him a little bit. Is he doing this because he wants to do it? Is he being compelled to do this? And it relates back to our theme of fate versus choice, right? Is he fated, a puppet on a string, or is he making his own choices here? And I think the theme is also interesting because it sheds a lot of light on Penelope and what a really incredible character she is. Mysterious and smart and deceiving, but ultimately loyal. Back to book 5, though, Calypso really can't understand why Odysseus would want to be with Penelope as opposed to being with her. She recognizes that she's much more beautiful than Penelope. She is a goddess, and she's immortal. If Odysseus decided to stay with Calypso, they could live together in perfection on an island, and he could basically ascend to godhood. So why would Odysseus give all of that up in order to go back to being mortal? Why give up literal perfection in Calypso to go back to, comparatively speaking, the very average Penelope? Calypso tells Odysseus right to his face, quote, "After these years with me, you still desire your old home? Even so, I wish you well. If you could see it all before you go, all the adversity you face at sea, you would stay here and guard this house and be immortal. Though you wanted her forever, that bride for whom you pine each day. Can I be less desirable than she is? Less interesting? Less beautiful? Can mortals compare with goddesses in grace and form?" End quote. The response of Odysseus tells us a lot about him, and oftentimes in whatever translation of the Odyssey you read, there are epithets that precede characters' names. So an epithet is like a description of what that character is like. And in a poem that was meant to be recited, or at the very least came from an oral tradition at some point in its origin, and we're going to talk about the origin of Homer and how this play got made in the oral tradition of ancient Greece in the next episode, but every time Odysseus gets mentioned, he's Odysseus the great tactician. Odysseus the great tactician. Odysseus the great tactician. Or the cunning strategist Odysseus. The cunning strategist Odysseus. And these epithets are repeated over and over, and it helps us get a sense of what Homer's trying to instill in us about Odysseus. And Odysseus gives a very tactful answer because he doesn't want to tick Calypso off at this very late stage in the game where he might be finally getting a chance to go home. And if he says he thinks Penelope is more beautiful than Calypso, then he could get in trouble. But if he lies, he could get in trouble. So Odysseus says that, yes, the beauty of Calypso is unmatched. And this seems to appease Calypso, and Odysseus just says he's been away from home so long that he wants to go home. And Calypso seems to accept that. But that answer doesn't get at that second part of Calypso's question, which is, why would you want to go back to being mortal? Why would you give up immortality? Especially after you've gotten a little tease of it. So this is another huge theme of the Odyssey, and I call it the taste of Elysium. So Elysium is this place in the ancient Greek afterlife that's reserved for probably only the few and the far between, but it's a place of perfection where you could live happy and content and doing all the things you wanted forever and be immortal in that state of perfection. Odysseus has gotten a taste of Elysium on the island with Calypso, and she's basically offering him the full experience. Incredibly, remarkably, he says no to that, and he chooses to go back to the life of mortality, the life of imperfection, the life of sorrow and grief, memory, and eventually death. Reading through this sequence reminded me of a much more modern fantasy, The Lord of the Rings, where there are these elves who have the ability to live forever, but some choose to stay and fight with the humans or sometimes even marry them. And on the first pass through or read through, you might think that those decisions are based on loyalty and friendship and love, which they are. But there might also be something about the world of impermanence and imperfection. And in that world, the stakes are high in every moment. And maybe there's something more real about that world than the world of perfection. Earlier on, I mentioned that there was something a little bit off about Telemachus's visit to the king of Sparta, Menelaus, and his wife Helen, who was the proximate cause of the Trojan War. They're simultaneously celebrating, but they're also grieving. And then Helen comes out with this tincture of forgetting where she wants to make everybody forget their sorrows and their griefs and just have a good night of sleep. And I think it's an interesting parallel to contrast Menelaus with Odysseus. So Menelaus kind of accepts this world of the gods, right? Helen is half a god and he gets to live in comfort and he's free of pain and he can take the tincture of forgetting whenever he wants and he doesn't have to feel sorrow or pain. But again, why would the half goddess Helen have to drug the wine if everything was perfect? Why would it be needed unless there was something just sad under the surface about this lifestyle? Calypso, in turn, wonders why Odysseus would reject this perfect life of ease that she's offering him, but Odysseus rejects it in favor of the very things that Calypso is confused by, the things that make men mortal, and ideas like glory and pride and virtuous death and resilience and overcoming hardships and having little victories that add up to big victories. And all of this comes along with the package of mortality. And when you look at things that way, all of a sudden, Calypso's island and Calypso's bargain and the taste of Elysium starts to seem a little bit more ominous. Classicist D.S. Carne Ross talks about Calypso's island saying, quote, "There is something disquieting, even sinister about it. Black poplars grow there, trees that, as we will hear later, are also found in Persephone's grove in the world of the dead. Cypresses too, funerary trees in the Mediterranean. Her name suggests that she is the hider. Calyptane, to hide. Fittingly so called, for she has hidden Odysseus, withdrawing him from the life of heroic action. He was happy there at first, and we can understand why. After his trials at war and at sea, her island paradise must have come as a blessed relief. But her spell is worn off, and she has, quote-unquote, ceased to please, Homer says laconically. End quote. So perhaps looking at things through this perspective shows us that Calypso's island is a prison. Odysseus is there not by his consent, and he's being abused here. But ultimately, the fact that Odysseus chooses a fleeting life and humanity over immortality tells us a lot about who he is as a person. There is a theme here of the dangers of that taste of Elysium and what happens when you get caught up in perfection, feeling bliss all the time. You can lose track of home. You can lose track of your memories. And it brings up these interesting questions of human flaws and comparing that with what godhood and perfection is. And again, I think it's a theme to keep looking at as we continue through the Odyssey here. At any rate, Calypso ultimately allows Odysseus to build a big raft, and she gives him a cloak and a warning that there's going to be some tough times ahead. And with that, Odysseus is off. After a few days at sea, Poseidon, who we're going to find out later is pretty ticked at Odysseus, sends a massive storm, shipwrecks him completely, and he's close to drowning. He's trying to hang on to pieces of the raft. A sea nymph appears to him and gives him her cloak and tells him he needs to swim to shore, trust in fate, trust in the gods, and you're going to make it to shore. Odysseus doesn't think he can make it, and he stays clinging to the boat. And so Poseidon sends another round, which almost drowns him. And then finally, Odysseus swims to shore, taking the advice of the nymph. But it is this interesting moment where, again, you have fate conflicting with Odysseus's choice, right? And is there free will, or are the gods orchestrating everything? Eventually, he symbolically sheds Calypso's cloak and puts that chapter behind him, and he takes the cloak of this sea nymph, and this helps him swim to shore. He winds up on the shores of a place called Phaeacia, where he's completely exhausted and beaten. He's completely naked. He finds a place in the forest to sleep, and that sets us up for the next podcast in a few weeks, which will be books 6 through 10 of the Odyssey. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe on Patreon for bonus episodes, video essays, behind-the-scenes content, and other perks. You can also join the Patreon for free to get a monthly recommendations email and a sneak peek at what's up next. You can support in other ways by subscribing and leaving a rating or review in your podcast app, by following on social media, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, etc., by sharing with a friend, or simply by continuing to listen. You can also sign up for my email newsletter, which has some written pieces and podcast updates every now and then. Links to all of this stuff are in the show notes. Any comments or suggestions you can send to reflectinghistory@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. That's it for now.